9:13 in the morning, the most advanced nuclear submarine in the world sent a message that changed the Navy forever. It said, "Experiencing minor difficulties." 6 minutes later, the USS Thresher was gone. But what nobody talks about, what the classified files buried for decades, is what might have happened in the hours after she disappeared. Because another submarine, the USS Seawolf, heard something. Deep below the Atlantic, metal against metal, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone banging on a hull. Let's start at the beginning. The USS Thresher was not just a submarine, she was a statement. Launched in 1960, she was the fastest, quietest, deepest diving nuclear attack sub the United States had ever built. Her hull was constructed with a new high-strength steel alloy. She carried the Navy's most advanced sonar, the most sophisticated anti-submarine weapons system in existence. The Navy was so proud of her that they built an entire class of submarines around her design, 14 of them. Thresher was going to be the future. On April 9, 1963, she left Kittery, Maine, with 129 men aboard, 12 officers, 96 enlisted sailors, a Navy staff officer, and 17 civilian technicians and engineers from the shipyard who were along to observe post-overhaul sea trials. She rendezvoused in the open Atlantic with the submarine rescue ship USS Skylark, which would stand by on the surface while the Thresher conducted her deep diving tests. The night passed without incident. The morning of April 10 was clear and calm. At 7:47 a.m., Thresher reported she was beginning her deep dive test, a slow circular descent to her maximum test depth of 1,300 feet. It was a routine procedure she had done before, a controlled plunge into pressure, checking systems, verifying the integrity of every seal and joint and pipe fitting. Then she would blow her ballast tanks, fill them with air to increase buoyancy, and rise back toward the surface. Simple, procedural, safe. At 9:13 a.m., the Skylark received a garbled transmission over the underwater telephone. The exact words were partially lost in static. What came through, clearly and unmistakably, was, "Experiencing minor difficulties. Have positive up angle. Attempting to blow." A positive up angle meant the submarine was already tilting bow upward, trying to surface. Attempting to blow meant she was working the ballast tank system. These were not the words of a crew at rest. These were the words of a crew fighting. The Skylark tried to respond. Silence. At 9:17 a.m., just 4 minutes after that transmission, the Skylark's crew heard something through their equipment that investigators would later describe as the sound of a submarine hull collapsing under pressure, a deep, low pulse, not an explosion, something quieter and more final than an explosion, the sound of steel folding. Thresher was at approximately 2,400 feet when she broke apart. Her test depth was 1,300. She had gone nearly twice as deep as she was designed to go. The ocean took her in seconds. The investigation that followed lasted months and produced 1,700 pages of testimony from 120 witnesses. The official conclusion, a piping joint in the engine room had likely failed, one of hundreds of silver-brazed joints that had never been properly inspected. Cold seawater had sprayed across an electrical panel. The reactor automatically shut down. Without propulsion and taking on water, the crew had tried to blow the ballast tanks, but moisture had frozen in the high-pressure air system, a known flaw that had been reported and never corrected. The submarine, growing heavier as water flooded in, tipped, plunged, and imploded somewhere between 1,500 and 2,400 feet. All of that happened in approximately 3 minutes. From the first failure to the final collapse, 3 minutes. The Navy declared that all 129 men died instantly when the hull imploded. For 30 years, that was the official end of the story. Then, in the early 2000s, classified documents began to be released, slowly, partially, under court order, and something strange surfaced in the records of the USS Seawolf, one of the submarines dispatched to search the area. The Seawolf's operational log described diving to search for the Thresher not just on April 10, but on April 11. And then April 12, nearly 48 hours after the implosion. The log documented metal-on-metal sounds detected by the Seawolf's sonar, rhythmic sounds, the kind that might be made by someone striking a hull from the inside. The Seawolf attempted to communicate it, requested 5 bangs in response. More sounds were detected, though they were never confirmed to match the pattern. The experts who reviewed these documents are divided. Norman Polmar, one of the most cited naval analysts in American history and author of Death of the USS Thresher, flatly disbelieves that any crew survived past the implosion. The hull, he notes, was found in 6 separate pieces, scattered across the ocean floor at 8,400 feet. There is no structural mechanism by which any compartment could have remained intact. The sounds the Seawolf heard, he says, were almost certainly other ships in the area. But here's what no one can fully dismiss. The Seawolf's crew believed what they were hearing. They dove 3 times over 48 hours, convinced something was down there. The log entries are not the entries of people who thought they were chasing phantom noise. They are the entries of experienced submariners who believed, urgently and specifically, that they were communicating with someone alive on the ocean floor. No one will ever know for certain. The Navy's position has not changed. Everyone died instantly. The documents were eventually assessed as containing probable errors, the Seawolf most likely hearing the other search vessels and submarines operating in the crowded rescue zone. But consider this. You are aboard the Thresher. You are a sailor or a shipyard engineer aboard for what was supposed to be a routine test. At 9:13 you feel something wrong. A shudder, a sound, the lights flicker, the reactor alarm sounds. Somewhere behind you, water is getting in. You have 3 minutes. Your commanding officer is on the phone trying to reach Skylark. The ballast tank system is fighting ice buildup in the high-pressure air valves. The submarine is tilting, slowly at first, then faster. The gauges are moving in directions they should not move. The pressure is changing. The sounds the hull makes when it is under stress are sounds you have been trained to recognize. 3 minutes is both too long and not long enough. It is long enough to know. It is not long enough to change anything. The Navy eventually found the Thresher broken across the seabed in 6 major sections, debris scattered over a mile of ocean floor 8,400 feet down. Investigators described the wreckage as looking like a submarine that had been fed through a shredding machine. No remains were recovered. The Navy classified the site as a war grave. The Sub-Safe program, the most rigorous submarine safety overhaul in American naval history, was created directly as a result of the Thresher's loss. Every U.S. submarine built or modified since 1963 has been built to Sub-Safe standards. Not a single Sub-Safe certified submarine has ever been lost. The program is, by any measure, one of the most successful safety initiatives in military history. The 129 men of the Thresher are why. Their families received the standard notification. They waited on the pier in Groton, Connecticut on the afternoon of April 10, 1963, in the hours when the Thresher had not yet been officially declared lost, but the Navy already knew. The wives, the children, the parents, standing in the cold spring air at the waterfront, waiting for a submarine that had already been at the bottom of the Atlantic for hours. That detail, more than any technical failure, is the thing that refuses to leave. The Navy knew. The families waited, and 8,400 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, the USS Thresher lay in pieces, carrying 129 men into an ocean that would not give them back. The Seawolf heard something, metal against metal, rhythmic, deliberate. We will never know what it was. We will never know what the last 3 minutes were like. That is the horror the deep ocean keeps most completely, not the evidence, but the space where the evidence was. The absence shaped exactly like the thing that's missing. The Thresher is still down there. It has never been moved. It never will be. She is still on eternal patrol. The note was found folded in the breast pocket of a dead man, wrapped in plastic to protect it from the water that had filled the compartment around him. It was dated 2 hours after the explosions that sank the submarine. The handwriting was steady. The man who wrote it was Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. He knew he was going to die. He wrote it anyway. It said, in part, all the crew from the 6th, 7th, and 8th compartments went over to the 9th. There are 23 people here. None of us can get to the surface. And then, below that, a message to his wife. 23 men, in a compartment at the rear of a nuclear submarine on the floor of the Barents Sea, 354 feet beneath the surface, alive. For how long, even now, is disputed, but alive, waiting, in the dark and the cold, with whatever oxygen they had, while the world above them, the Russian Navy, the government of Vladimir Putin, the rescue teams that arrived too late, and the foreign teams that arrived and were turned away, made decisions that sealed their fate as surely as the ocean did. This is the story of the Kursk, and it is not the story most people know. August 12, 2000. The Kursk, named for the site of the largest tank battle in history, was the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet. At 505 feet long, she was one of the largest attack submarines ever built, Oscar II class, double-hulled, carrying 24 cruise missiles capable of sinking aircraft carriers. She was on exercise in the Barents Sea, participating in Russia's first major naval maneuver since the collapse of the Soviet Union, an exercise meant to demonstrate that the Russian Navy was still a force that mattered, still capable of the power it had projected throughout the Cold War. The exercise was going well. The Kursk had fired one torpedo successfully. She was preparing a second simulated attack on the carrier Admiral Kuznetsov. At 11:28 a.m., the first explosion hit. Sailors aboard the nearby battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki felt the shockwave through the hull. Norwegian seismic monitoring stations hundreds of miles away registered the event at 1.5 on the Richter scale. The cause, a faulty weld in the casing of a torpedo fuel chamber, had allowed highly volatile hydrogen peroxide propellant to leak. The propellant ignited. The resulting fire detonated the torpedo's 900-pound warhead. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, the accumulated heat from the first explosion reached the remaining torpedo warheads in the forward compartment. 5 to 7 warheads detonated simultaneously. The second explosion was registered at 4.2 on the Richter scale. It was felt as far away as Alaska. The forward 3 compartments, the torpedo room, the control room, the command spaces, were obliterated. Everyone in them died in seconds. The Kursk, on fire and flooding, sank to the seabed at a 20-degree angle. The nuclear reactors, protected by 13 centimeters of steel and their own emergency systems, shut down safely. In the rear of the submarine, the men who survived the explosions did what their training dictated. They moved aft, away from the fire, away from the flooding, into the rear compartments and, finally, into Compartment 9, the emergency compartment, the last refuge, the rearmost space in the ship. 23 men. The lights were out. The reactors were off. The temperature in the Barents Sea in August is just above freezing. The men had battery-powered lights, emergency oxygen generators called chemical scrubbers, and each other. Kolesnikov wrote his note at 3:15 p.m., more than 3 hours after the explosions. He listed the names of all 23 survivors. He described the situation clearly and without panic. He noted that they could not surface. He said not to despair. He had reason for despair. The Russian rescue operation was a catastrophe from the first hour. The rescue ships arrived and found they could not seal properly to the Kursk's rescue hatch. The Russian diving bells were poorly maintained. The rescue capsule failed to dock on 8 separate attempts. Weather conditions worsened. For 5 days, the Russian Navy told the world and the families of the crew that communication had been established with survivors, that rescue was underway, that the situation was under control. None of it was true. The Russian Navy had no reliable contact with the Kursk. The rescue equipment was not working, and foreign governments, Norway and Britain, had offered deep-sea rescue capability within hours of the disaster. Russia declined the offers for 5 days. 5 days. On August 17, Putin finally accepted foreign assistance. Norwegian divers reached the Kursk on August 19 and opened the rear escape hatch in under 2 hours, something the Russian rescue teams had spent a week failing to accomplish. Inside, they found all 118 crew members dead. The investigation that followed reconstructed, from physical evidence and the notes recovered from Compartment 9, the final hours of the survivors. Sometime after Kolesnikov wrote his note, when the oxygen supply began to drop, someone attempted to replace an exhausted potassium superoxide chemical oxygen cartridge, in the dark, in a compartment under growing pressure with oily water pooling on the floor. The cartridge was dropped. It hit the seawater. Potassium superoxide reacts violently with water. The reaction generates intense heat almost instantaneously. In the pressurized, oxygen-rich atmosphere of Compartment 9, the result was a flash fire, burning through the remaining oxygen in seconds. The last survivors of the Kursk died in that instant. By best estimate, this happened sometime in the late hours of August 13. The note was written on August 12. They were alive for more than 6 hours after the explosions. The families were told for 5 of those hours that rescue was coming, that there was contact, that the crew was responding. Kolesnikov's note survived because he had wrapped it in plastic. His wife Olga received it through the Russian government months after the submarine was raised from the seabed in October 2001. She read the message he had written her in the dark, in the cold, in the last compartment of a sinking ship, while the world above him failed to move fast enough to save him. She has said in interviews that he sounded calm. She has said he told her not to worry. He was 27 years old. The Kursk disaster is documented, investigated, litigated, and publicly known. What it is not, what no public account has ever been able to make fully real, is the sensory reality of Compartment 9, the dark, the cold seeping through the double hull, the sounds of a submarine on the ocean floor, the settling, the pressure changes, the distant sounds of rescue equipment that kept failing to dock overhead, the 23 men breathing steadily, rationing air, listening. They banged on the hull. The rhythmic sound of metal on metal, the distress signal that submariners use when other communications fail, traveled through the Barents Sea water to Russian surface ships that either didn't hear it or couldn't respond in time. They were 354 feet down, a relatively shallow depth for a submarine. In good conditions, experienced divers can reach that depth. The water was cold, the visibility poor, and the conditions worsening, but Norwegian divers reached the hatch in 2 hours when they were finally permitted to try. The question that Russia has never fully answered, and that the families of the crew have never stopped asking, is simply, what if the foreign offer had been accepted on day 1 instead of day 5? No one knows. But 23 men spent their last hours in the dark in Compartment 9, waiting for a rescue that kept getting delayed, while governments weighed the optics of appearing to need help. The note survived, wrapped in plastic, steady handwriting, 23 names. Not to despair, Kolesnikov wrote. He was 27 years old, writing in the dark, at the bottom of the Barents Sea, while above him the world moved too slowly. The Kursk was scrapped. The compartments were sealed. A memorial was built in Murmansk from fragments of the hull. On it, 118 names are engraved. 23 of them spent hours writing goodbye. The Scorpion was already broken before she left port. The crew knew it. They had a name for her. They called her the Scrap Iron. May 1968. The Cold War was at a particular kind of fever, not the acute crisis of Cuba, but the chronic, grinding, daily tension of two superpowers that had pointed nuclear weapons at each other for so long that the aiming had become routine. Submarines were central to this routine. American nuclear submarines tracked Soviet submarines. Soviet submarines tracked American ones. The ocean was full of this dark choreography, invisible to the surface world, conducted in silence at depth. USS Scorpion, hull number SSN 589, skipjack class, nuclear-powered, had been at this work for 8 years. She was fast, capable, and had once been considered one of the finest attack submarines in the fleet. By 1968, she was something else. She had a chronic freon leak from the refrigeration systems. An electrical fire had broken out in an escape trunk earlier in the year from a water leak that shorted a shore power connection. The propeller shaft seal was leaking seawater into the machinery. In 1967, she had experienced vibrations so severe the entire boat seemed to be corkscrewing through the water. No cause was ever found. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had flagged her in 1967 for a full overhaul, a comprehensive top-to-bottom refit that would have taken months and cost significantly more than the Navy wanted to spend. Instead, Scorpion received emergency repairs, a patch job. Her depth was restricted to 500 feet in lieu of the full sub-safe implementation that the Thresher disaster had mandated, but that had not yet been completed on the Scorpion. The crew went back out. One crewman, Dan Rogers, refused to go on the 1968 Mediterranean deployment. He told his superiors that he believed the Scorpion was a danger to her crew. He was reassigned. The Scorpion sailed without him. She completed her Mediterranean deployment without incident, tracked Soviet vessels, attended exercises with Allied navies, and in May 1968 was given new orders. Divert from her return course to observe a Soviet naval flotilla operating in the Atlantic near the Azores. Monitor their movements, report, then come home. Her expected arrival at Norfolk, Virginia was May 27, 1968. On that afternoon, the families of her crew, wives, children, parents, waited on the pier at the Norfolk Navy Yard as they had waited for countless previous arrivals. The Scorpion did not come. Repeated radio calls using her call sign Brandywine went unanswered. The Navy's Situation Room in the Pentagon had a large chart of the Atlantic. Someone drew a line along the likely route from Gibraltar to Norfolk, 3,300 miles of ocean. and the search began. They searched for months. In late October 1968, the research vessel USNS Mizar, equipped with deep-sea cameras, found the Scorpion 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. She was 9,800 feet down. She had apparently impacted the ocean floor at speed and skidded, debris scattering across the seabed in a pattern that acoustic analysts had predicted using a technique called Bayesian probability, a mathematical method of estimating location that had never been used for this purpose before. The technique worked. It found the Scorpion. What the cameras revealed was a submarine that had not survived gently. The hull was torn, twisted, and bent. The forward section had been compressed. The sail, the fin that rises above the main body, had separated. One of the external running lights had been found in an open position, suggesting either the submarine had been near the surface when something catastrophic occurred, or that an internal explosion had forced it open from within. The investigation that followed produced one of the most contested rulings in U.S. naval history. The official Navy Court of Inquiry concluded that the cause of the sinking could not be definitively ascertained. And that was the conclusion they published. That was what the families received. But the story behind that conclusion is darker. The court's actual classified findings, declassified in 1993, 25 years after the disaster, concluded that the most probable cause was an explosion of large magnitude within the vessel, and the most likely source of that explosion, according to acoustic analysts who had studied recordings from the Navy's Socius hydrophone network, was a torpedo. Specifically, a Mark 37 torpedo with a faulty battery. The battery used a thin metal foil barrier to separate two volatile chemicals. When the foil degraded, which it did over time, from the vibrations normally experienced aboard a nuclear submarine, the chemicals mixed. They generated heat. Heat caused a runaway reaction. If that reaction reached sufficient temperature while the torpedo was still in its tube, the result would be ignition, a hot run in submarine parlance. A live torpedo running hot in its own launch tube aimed at nothing and dangerous to everything. The operating manual for this scenario was clear. If a torpedo goes to hot run in the tube, it must be fired immediately out into the ocean away from the submarine. A running torpedo was designed to seek its target using acoustic homing. A torpedo fired from a tube, if it heard nothing in front of it and turned back toward its loudest nearby sound, would seek the loudest thing in range. In 1968, at 9,800 feet below the Atlantic surface, the loudest thing in range would have been the Scorpion herself. 99 men. The Navy's official position has never acknowledged the torpedo theory. No family has ever received an official explanation. The Ordnance Systems Command, which oversaw the Mark 37 torpedo, was cleared of responsibility in the non-public findings. A classified review panel completed in 1970, 2 years after the inquiry, took a different position entirely, suggesting mechanical flooding was the more likely cause. The Navy's position is that the cause remains uncertain. Uncertain. That word has sat with the families of 99 men for more than 50 years. What we know. The Scorpion was broken. She had a crew who knew she was broken. She had a crewman who refused to sail on her because he believed she was unsafe, and he was right, and he survived because of it. She sailed anyway, into the North Atlantic, toward the Azores, toward a rendezvous with a Soviet naval group that she was meant to observe without being observed. And on May 22, 1968, something happened. An explosion, a flooding, a torpedo, a combination of failures long deferred by a Navy that needed her to keep sailing and couldn't spare the months to fix her properly. The scrap iron went down with all hands. 99 men. Their names are on memorials. Their families received no definitive answer because the definitive answer was classified, and the classified answer was disputed, and the disputed answer was buried behind layers of institutional reasoning about national security and Cold War sensitivity that felt, to the people waiting for it, very much like silence. The wreck sits at 9,800 feet. It is protected as a war grave. The nuclear reactor is still down there. The 2 nuclear torpedoes are still down there. They will be there for a very long time. The Scorpion is still on eternal patrol. Unlike the Thresher, she went down in water warm enough that there is, theoretically, no mystery about what happened in the final moments. The acoustic recordings captured the sequence. The hull implosion was detected and timed. From the first catastrophic event to the final collapse, 3 minutes and 12 seconds. The same duration as the Thresher, 3 minutes. It comes up again and again in these stories the way certain numbers do in nightmares. 3 minutes from a working submarine to a debris field at the bottom of the Atlantic. 99 men. No distress call. No survivors. One crewman standing on a dock in Norfolk who had refused to go, who had said the ship was dangerous, and who spent the rest of his life knowing he had been right. No cause. uncertain. The ocean does not offer certainty, it offers depth. The wives waited on the pier in Norfolk. Some of them had small children with them. Some of them had driven hours for the arrival. All of them had received no advance warning that anything was wrong, because the Navy did not know, and because even when the Navy began to suspect, the protocol was silence until certainty, and certainty never came. The search for the Scorpion lasted 6 months. During those months, the wives lived in a particular kind of limbo that has no civilian equivalent, officially notified that their husband's submarine was missing and presumed lost, but carrying the word presumed as though it were permission to hope. It was not. The Navy was being careful with language, not with feelings. The Scorpion was found, definitively placed at the bottom of the Atlantic with no survivable space remaining. The wives were notified. The children grew up without fathers. The cause remains officially uncertain. The files are still partly classified. The crew's names are on the memorial wall at the Naval Submarine Base New London, alongside the crew of the Thresher, alongside every other American submariner lost at sea. Eternal patrol. The scrap iron went to the bottom with all her secrets intact. So did the Navy. So did the Cold War. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. His name was Sergei Preminin. He was 20 years old. He was a seaman, the lowest rank in the Soviet Navy. He had no special training in nuclear reactor systems. He had been assigned to the K-219 the way young men were assigned to things in the Soviet military, because someone needed to go, and he was there. On October 6, 1986, he climbed into the reactor compartment of a sinking submarine that had been on fire for 3 days, turned the shutdown rods on both reactors by hand, and could not get out. The hatch had been sealed from the outside by pressure differential. He died in the reactor compartment of K-219 at the bottom of the North Atlantic. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Star. He was 20 years old. This is the story of K-219, and it begins 3 days earlier with a sound. October 3, 1986. The K-219, a Yankee-class Soviet ballistic missile submarine, was on a routine Cold War nuclear deterrence patrol in the North Atlantic, approximately 700 miles northeast of Bermuda. She was 15 years old by submarine standards, and she carried 16 R-27U ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering nuclear warheads across thousands of miles of ocean. She was, in the calculus of Cold War deterrence, the thing that made the other side hesitate. A submarine you couldn't find, carrying weapons you couldn't defend against. At 5:14 a.m. Moscow time, a crewman in the forward missile compartment noticed water dripping from under the plug of missile tube number 6. He reported it. The officer on duty reported it up the chain. The watch continued. 5 minutes later, seawater had reached the rocket fuel. The R-27U missile used highly toxic and extremely volatile liquid propellants. When the seawater contacted the fuel residue in the tube, it produced chlorine gas, nitrogen dioxide, and enough heat to trigger a runaway reaction. By 5:32 a.m., the reaction was beyond containment. At 5:38 a.m., missile tube number 6 exploded. The explosion ejected the missile and its nuclear warheads from the submarine into the Atlantic Ocean. The blast killed 2 sailors instantly. A third died minutes later from toxic gas inhalation. Through a breach in the hull, seawater began flooding in, and K-219, which had been at 40 meters depth, began sinking, dropping to over 300 meters before the captain, Commander Igor Britanov, managed to blow all tanks and halt the dive. 25 sailors were trapped in a sealed section. Britanov personally ordered the chief engineer to open the hatch despite the gas contamination risk. The 25 men were pulled out. But the reactors had not automatically shut down as designed. In the chaos of the explosion and the fire and the flooding and the toxic gas filling the compartments, the automatic shutdown system had failed. Both nuclear reactors were still running on a submarine that was burning from the inside, taking on water and drifting on the surface of the North Atlantic, while the captain desperately tried to hold the vessel together with a crew that was vomiting from gas exposure and half-blinded by fumes. A nuclear meltdown in the middle of the Atlantic near Bermuda was not a theoretical scenario anymore. Britanov radioed Moscow. Moscow's response was not, "What do you need?" Moscow's response was, in effect, "Why can't you fix this?" The Politburo, when informed, immediately worried about two things: whether the Americans would try to salvage the wreck for intelligence, and whether the crew's actions constituted incompetence or cowardice. Gorbachev would later ask, in a recorded Politburo meeting that was classified for decades and released by American archivists, whether the crew's panic had caused the accident, or whether crew cowardice had made it worse. A Soviet merchant vessel, the Anatoly Vasilyev, arrived and attached a tow line to the K-219. The plan was to bring her home. Soviet submarines carried their secrets, and a wreck on the ocean floor near Bermuda was unacceptable, too close to American waters, too accessible for CIA recovery operations like Project Azorian, which had already demonstrated the American willingness and capability to raise Soviet submarines from the deep. The tow line held for a while. For 3 days, K-219 sat on the surface, a floating disaster. Corrosive gases were eating through the submarine's internal piping. The reactor compartment was inaccessible from inside. The radiation and gas levels were lethal. The ship was slowly dying around the men who were trying to save her, and Moscow kept asking why they couldn't do more. On October 6, 3 days after the explosion, flooding inside the submarine reached a point beyond recovery. The tow line from the merchant vessel broke. The K-219 was sinking. This is when Sergei Preminin volunteered. He had already made one trip into the reactor compartment. He and another sailor, an officer, had gone in together to attempt manual shutdown. The officer had been overcome by heat and radiation and had to be pulled out. Preminin had stayed longer. He had turned one of the 4 shutdown rods by hand. Each rod required significant physical effort to move. He had come out alive the first time. He went back in alone. He turned the second reactor's shutdown rods. Both nuclear reactors were now secured. A nuclear disaster in the North Atlantic had been prevented by a 20-year-old seaman turning metal rods by hand in a compartment full of radiation and superheated air. He tried to open the hatch. The pressure differential from outside, the submarine listing flooding, the compartment pressure changing, had created a seal he couldn't break alone. He could not open it from inside. He tried. He kept trying. The K-219 sank at 11:03 a.m. on October 6, 1986. It took 34 nuclear warheads and 2 nuclear reactors to the bottom of the Hatteras abyssal plain at a depth of 6,000 meters, nearly 20,000 feet. It is still there. Sergei Preminin is still there. Commander Britanov was subsequently charged with negligence, sabotage, and treason. He was never imprisoned. The charges were eventually dropped in 1987 when a change in Soviet leadership reshuffled the politics around who was responsible for what. Britanov went home. He had been the last man to leave the K-219 alive, abandoning ship only seconds before she went under. He had done everything a captain could do and watched it not be enough. The K-219 has 34 nuclear warheads on it, reactor fuel, all of it in 20,000 feet of water at the bottom of the North Atlantic, in a submarine that has been down there for nearly 40 years, rusting, slowly compromising. In 1988, a mere submersible documented that the hull was already showing significant deterioration. No country has claimed responsibility for the environmental monitoring of the wreck. The radioactive material will remain on the ocean floor, leaking into the surrounding water on a timeline measured in geological rather than human time. 20-year-old Sergei Preminin prevented a nuclear explosion. He did it with his bare hands. He is still at the bottom of the North Atlantic. He has never been recovered. He was posthumously awarded a medal. The K-219 is not the only nuclear wreck on the ocean floor. The USS Scorpion lies at 9,800 feet with nuclear weapons aboard. The USS Thresher's reactor is at 8,400 feet. These are known, documented, partly declassified facts. Nuclear material sits on the ocean floor in multiple locations, monitored inconsistently, in vessels degrading at their own geological pace. But K-219 carries something the others don't: a person. Sergei Preminin is still in the reactor compartment. He has never been recovered. He is classified as lost at sea. The captain who survived him, Igor Britanov, was charged, tried, and eventually acquitted after political reshuffling made his prosecution inconvenient. He went home. He wrote a memoir. He has said that he thinks about Preminin. The Politburo meeting at which Gorbachev asked whether the crew had panicked was declassified by American archivists, not Russian ones, and released through the National Security Archive in Washington. The Russian government has released very little about K-219 beyond the basics. The warheads are still there. In 2001, a Norwegian-Russian expedition photographed the wreck. The hull was already significantly deteriorated: rust, biological growth, structural compromise in areas that had burned or flooded. The missile tubes were partially open. What is happening to the nuclear material inside, at 20,000 feet, in the long, slow dark of the abyssal plain, belongs to a timeline longer than the governments that put it there. Sergei Preminin was 20 years old. He climbed into a reactor compartment on a sinking submarine, turned 2 rods by hand, prevented what would have been the largest nuclear accident in the history of the Atlantic Ocean, and then could not open the hatch. He is still at 20,000 feet. The reactor he secured has been cold for decades. The ship around him has been rusting since 1986. The warheads he protected the ocean from are in a slow dissolution that no government is formally responsible for monitoring. He was 20 years old. He is still there. At approximately 130 feet, the ocean begins to do something to the human brain. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning or a noticeable transition. One moment you are a diver, trained and equipped, in possession of all your faculties. And then, gradually and completely without your consent, you are not. They call it nitrogen narcosis. They also call it the rapture of the deep. The name is not metaphorical. This is about what happens when the most reliable instrument in your possession, your own mind, becomes the thing that is trying to kill you. And the ocean is 8,000 feet deep, and you are 130 feet down, and you have absolutely no idea anything is wrong. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe. At sea level, at normal pressure, this is fine. But underwater, as depth increases, pressure increases too. 1 additional atmosphere of pressure for every 33 feet of descent. Under pressure, nitrogen behaves differently in human tissue. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It binds to receptors in the central nervous system. The mechanism is, in its precise operation, still not fully understood. The effect, however, is extremely well documented. At around 30 meters, approximately 100 feet, the nitrogen compressed into your bloodstream and tissues begins to produce an intoxicating effect comparable to several measures of alcohol consumed very quickly. Your confidence rises, your judgment degrades, your memory begins to slip, your perception of time changes, your emotional regulation softens. You may feel euphoric, you may feel nothing at all, and critically and most terrifyingly, you cannot tell. The research on this point is consistent across decades of military and civilian diving medicine. Nitrogen narcosis does not feel like being impaired, it feels like clarity. Divers under narcosis frequently report feeling sharper, more focused, more confident than usual. They make wrong decisions and feel certain those decisions are right. They look at their gauges and read incorrect numbers. They signal to their dive buddies that everything is fine, and they believe it, and they are dying. Commercial diver Sherry Ferguson, who has studied nitrogen narcosis at Simon Fraser University for years, puts it this way: in hindsight, you are clearly impaired. In the moment, you rarely are. The cases that make this real are the ones that survive to be documented. In Egypt, at the dive site near Dahab, known as the Blue Hole, a vertical underwater sinkhole that drops to over 300 feet and is among the most statistically deadly recreational dive sites in the world, a diver is conducting a 40-meter certification dive with an instructor. They are at depth. The instructor administers a standard narcosis check, a math problem. The diver solves it correctly, faster than he would have on the surface. He is proud of this. He passes. He then proceeds to confuse the inflator button on his buoyancy vest with the dump valve. The inflator fills the vest with air. He begins to sink. His legs kick automatically, propelling him upward in his mind. He is smiling. He is absolutely certain he is ascending. The video footage from the surface shows him kicking steadily downward, grinning, into deeper water. His instructor intercepted him. That story ends with the diver alive on a dive boat watching the footage, unable to reconcile the smiling, sinking figure with his memory of a perfectly normal dive. He said he felt fine the entire time. He said he was sure he was going up. In Canada, a diver on a winter dive at 32 meters experiences the onset of narcosis unexpectedly. Cold water is a known accelerant of the condition. The ocean floor transforms, in her perception, into a 2-dimensional cartoon landscape. Her dive buddy, a person she has dived with dozens of times, becomes to her eyes a soulless outline, drawn in felt pen against a flat underwater background. She described it afterward as a Charlie Brown animation. She knew something was wrong. She was not sure what. She checked her gauges, she could read them, but processing what the numbers meant took effort that normally required none. She made it to the surface. She described fissures in her trust of enclosed spaces that lasted months afterward. At the Blue Hole of Dahab, which has claimed an estimated 130 to 200 diver lives, more than any other dive site on the planet, nitrogen narcosis is a contributing factor in most of the deaths. The site features an arch at approximately 55 meters that divers attempt to swim through, ascending on the other side. At 55 meters, narcosis is severe. Divers attempting the arch have been found at the bottom, apparently continuing to swim in the wrong direction, having become completely disoriented about which way was up. One of the documented features of advanced narcosis at depths beyond 50 meters is that it can produce terror. Not confusion, not euphoria, pure, absolute, incomprehensible terror that arrives without identifiable cause. You are fully conscious, you are in your equipment, the water is the same water it was at 20 meters, nothing has changed that your rational mind can identify, and yet you are more afraid than you have ever been in your life, with no information to explain why, and no reliable cognitive process remaining to help you manage it. Your body wants to bolt for the surface. This is the death scenario. Ascending too quickly from depth, from gases dissolved in tissue under pressure, causes decompression sickness. The nitrogen that narcosis has been delivering to your tissues comes out of solution as bubbles, the way carbonation escapes a shaken bottle when opened. Bubbles in joints, bubbles in the spinal cord, bubbles in the brain. The bends can paralyze, the bends can kill, and so the correct response to wanting to bolt for the surface, to run, to escape, to get out of the water as fast as possible, is to go slowly, breathe, ascend at a measured rate, stop at decompression depths and wait, follow the algorithm, trust the process. This is what you must do when your brain is drunk and terrified and convinced that the safest thing in the world is to go up right now as fast as you can. The instructor cases in these records are perhaps the most quietly disturbing. In one documented incident, a dive instructor, a person who has conducted hundreds of dives, who has trained dozens of students, who knows the signs of narcosis in others because she has spent her career watching for them, develops narcosis on a deep training dive and becomes completely certain for several minutes that she needs to take her regulator out of her mouth. Not to signal distress, not to share air, she simply becomes, in the grip of the Rapture, absolutely convinced that she no longer needs it. She did not remove it. Something in the remaining functional layer of her cognition stopped her. She surfaced safely. She described the experience as feeling, in retrospect, like watching herself from outside her body, watching herself nearly do something that would have been immediately and certainly fatal, and being unable to explain why it had seemed reasonable. The ocean at depth is not an environment that forgives a mind that cannot be trusted. It is dark, and the pressure is real, and the cold moves through equipment that was not designed for long exposure, and the nitrogen is always there, in the air in your tank, in the blood in your body, doing its patient, invisible work at the cellular level. You cannot feel it arriving, you cannot feel it taking hold. You feel fine until you don't, and when you don't, the thing that would normally notice something is wrong is the same thing that is wrong. The Rapture of the deep is a real diagnosis, documented in naval and civilian medicine for nearly 200 years. Victor Junod described it in 1834, Jacques Cousteau named it. The Navy has run controlled studies, the physics are understood, the mechanism in the brain is studied in hyperbaric chambers. And yet it happens every diving season to experienced divers, to instructors, to people who have logged hundreds of dives and know every sign. Because knowing the signs only helps if the part of you that reads signs is still working. At 130 feet, with the ocean above you and the dark below, the most dangerous thing in the water is not the pressure or the cold or whatever might be moving in the darkness at the edge of your visibility. It is the feeling that everything is fine. Thank you for making it to the end. Please like and subscribe if you loved listening to the stories. Comment below to share if you found something disturbing. Thanks again for your support. See you soon with some new stories shared by real people.